Hello and welcome to yet another session of this course on 20th century American drama. So we're beginning a new play. We're beginning to discuss Arthur Miller's All My Sons, and this also needs to be read in continuation with the previous play, Death of a Salesman. And as we progress, we will also begin to see that there are certain kinds of continuities and some departures. And given that this play was written and produced at two different phases in terms of Arthur Miller's career as well as in terms of his theatrical exposure, you will find that certain themes which were beginning to gain strength in Death of a Salesman, they become more central in All My Sons. It's also a more direct critique of the American dream, and we also find that in terms of the attitude, in terms of the belief systems and value systems which are attributed to particular characters, they also emerge in stronger terms when we come to All My Sons. This play was written in 1946, and significantly, this was also one of the plays which gave Miller a lot of financial stability and confidence to continue as a playwright. So we find that in some sense this becomes a very significant play in his career, not just in terms of the thematic connections, but also in terms of his fulfillment as a playwright. And this was directed for Broadway as well, and we did see the significance of plays becoming really big hits in Broadway in some terms, that also bridge the gap between what drama is as a genre and what it becomes translated as when it becomes, a performance. So this was also, a much acclaimed play critically. It won a lot of popular awards as well. And in terms of its the foregrounding of the theme of the American dream, we find that it drew a lot of attention in the popular culture. It drew a lot of, gave rise to a lot of critical debates, and he was summoned before committees to discuss the kind of critique which was getting leveraged to the play. So the significance was layered. And we also find that in terms of laying the foundations of the critical foundations of American drama as a genre, this play also had played a major role in that sense. So this the setting becomes very important. This is set in the post Second World War period. The trauma of war, what war had left behind, it gets presented in a slightly different way altogether in this and play in All My Sons. This was based upon a true story, and this was, as some of you might be familiar with the general plot of the play already. So this is in the background of a manufacturing conspiracy in which a private company had to convince a set of army inspection officers to approve some defective aircraft engines. And this was, the background is of course the use of military warfare and the use of these equipment during the Second World War. This is also about how the context of the war had changed the dynamics of not just nations, not just territories, but how it also began to infiltrate into civilian life in some form or the other. It's also about the difficult choices that one needs to make in the wake of these bigger events happening, in the wake of these historical events which happen. So, though the major theme is a criticism of the American dream, it in some sense, just like Death of a Salesman, it continues to explore the ways in which the private lives become dictated by the public scenarios. So the nation, the life of the nation, the personal lives of the citizens, everything becomes entwined. Everything becomes informed by each other in very, very essential ways. This is also where we find that there's a continuing influence of European drama. There's a continuing influence, particularly of Henrik Ibsen, even during this time, and this was majorly influenced by Ibsen's play The Wild Duck. And this, in many ways, we can also see that the continuities that we can trace in American drama with that of the European drama, it also gave a certain trajectory to the genre in terms of evolving its critical traditions, in terms of establishing its unique nature. So the continuities were extremely important in setting the genre apart, and while also carving out its own unique path. So this is something that we will keep seeing in terms of particularly how realism becomes much coveted thing in terms of how realism becomes something very central to American drama. And even while staying in the forte of realism, we find that this genre continues to experiment with expressionist techniques, continues to experiment with a lot of newer technological things in terms of the staging, in terms of the props being used. So there is a very direct correlation between how drama gets written and how it gets performed, and which is why, as we had discussed before, Broadway also becomes a symbolic presence in defining the popularity and defining the critical reception of the genre. In some sense, we find that it continues even in the contemporary in terms of, the Broadway success a play enjoyed. And sometimes in a retrospective sense, the plays which enjoyed an immense Broadway success, they also get built into the canon too. So it's a two-way process which enriches the process of writing as well as this process of performance. Yeah. So this is also something that we will get to explore in greater detail as we progress with the reading of the play. So just like Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, we find that here also we have a male protagonist, a white male protagonist. So here this is the story, All My Sons is the story of Joe Keller. So Joe Keller is a self-made businessman, and this is about this entire play is about how, due to certain circumstances, he is forced to give up his integrity and his moral obligations towards society because he is also blinded. And then sometimes there is a dilemma, but overall we find that he also decides to pursue material gains and societal status, which are also part and parcel of this package that is offered by the American dream. So what distinguishes All My Sons in a very crude way with when we compare it with The Death of a Salesman is there's a compelling moral compass over here in All My Sons. The critique of the materialist concerns which are part and parcel of the American dream. It's more central, it is more evident, it is very deliberately foregrounded in All My Sons. So accordingly, we also find that the aspects of morality, the aspects of value systems which are highlighted in All My Sons are also more central when compared with the Death of a Salesman. So these are the major characters. It's a Keller family who's at the center of the play, just the way the Lohman family was in Death of a Salesman. Joe Keller, Larry, Chris, and Kate, yeah, and the Deaver family with Steve Deaver, Annie Deaver, and George Deaver. These are the central characters over here. We will get into the details when we begin to explore the play in more central terms. So this, in some sense, these two families come together in order to take the plot forward, and we also get to know of how how certain dialogues, certain exchanges in terms of the value system, in terms of the cultural traction, they also get defined by the way the two families are presented. It'll be useful to have a historical context in plays before we get into the discussion. This play was written in 1946, as mentioned, and this is a period immediately following the Second World War and the Great Depression. And we find that this period is very compelling in American history. This is the time when the nation begins to make a mark as a unique entity, but at the same time finds itself in the middle of all of these historical events in a way that it had never experienced before. So there are these high rates of inflation, which almost disturbing the entire economic fabric, and we find that people are becoming more materialistic and opportunistic because there aren't too many options at that time to go this way or that way. So we find that there is a wartime prosperity which emerges in America, which also, in a moralistic sense, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So this is the discomfort which plays like this are also trying to explore, trying to get into the heart of it, particularly from the perspective of a middle class individual, trying to get into the heart of this crisis and analyze it. Yeah, and this is in no way this could be seen as a judgmental play. It is trying to get into the heart of the matter and unpack this discomfort. So what happens is in both Death of a Salesman as well as in All My Sons, there are these typical characters who are being presented, who are in some sense driven by circumstances. They are not inherently evil, scheming, men, but in some sense they are driven into certain kinds of circumstances because of the societal compulsions, sometimes because of the particular situations with which the nation or the society at large are facing. So in some sense, we find that Willy Loman, he's not designed to be the kind of man who would let his family down. Yeah, his adultery and his engagement with his sons, none of that really reflects on what he is as a person, but there's also a certain compulsion which is built into it. There are certain kinds of behavioral patterns. There are certain kinds of behavioral patterns. There are certain kind of ideals that he is being forced to pursue. Yeah, sometimes in spite of himself. So this dilemma, this dichotomy, is brought out very centrally in both of these plays. So we find that there is this is the post World War period, and there's also a kind of wartime prosperity. So here is where the moral compass of the play also comes in slightly ambiguous terms as well. So there is certain kind of prosperity which is in alignment with some of the policies and the vision of the nation, but it's also conflicting heavily with some value systems, some middle class value systems. We find that there's a high demand for weapons during the war period, and also in the decades that follow. So America begins to flourish in an economic sense by finding a number of manufacturing industries which would also supply, the will also meet the demands of this the wartime. It's supplying the arms, ammunitions, and all. And this is something which continues to be problematic in some sense. When we look at it, the economic as well as the moral aspects of it. So we find that in very organic terms, it also gives rise to a lot of corrupted practices, particularly within the manufacturing industries, and we find a lot of value systems getting compromised over here. So, for instance, using substandard materials for more profit, and that leading to some catastrophe. That also happens to be the central theme in this play, the plot around which the central topic around which the plot moves. Yeah, so we find that there is a kind of prosperity which needs to be embraced for nationalist reasons, for also for materialist purposes, but we also find that it's conflicting with the value system on which the American society ideally has been built. So when we contrast this kind of prosperity and the corruption which is also a part of it with the ideal American dream, we find that in some sense Joe Keller is also deeply seated. The dilemma is deeply seated in Joe Keller's life itself, just that it begins to manufacture it, just that it begins to manifest in more grave terms than it did in Willy Loman's life. So if we very briefly try and compare these two characters, we find that Willy Loman in some sense becomes a victim, and that is also contributed heavily through the psychological dilemma that he is going through, and that there's a certain abstraction about it, which also makes it slightly more comfortable to deal with, because it also seems like there is some kind of a balanced view of the world outside which gets projected over here. But here in Joe Keller's life, we find that the catastrophes, the decisions are more tangible in some sense and some irreversible. It gets connected, every single step gets connected with the personal and the political and the public in almost irreversible ways, and making his tragedy more difficult, more difficult to deal with. Yeah. So this as the play progresses, we find that Joe Keller decides to turn himself to the police. He gets into a confession mode, and this is where the heart of the play also comes out. I think to him they were all my sons. Yeah, this is like implying the pilots, referring to all the pilots who died in the crash, and this man taking up the responsibility for that. Yeah, so in some sense the tragedy, as I mentioned, is in a more aggravated sense over here, while a character like Willy Loman, he takes responsibility for what goes wrong with his family, with his two sons. Here, that gets extended. The sense of family, the sense of empathy, it gets extended. So it's in so many different ways we find that there is an expansion of the American dream. There's a certain kind of inclusion of the American dream where almost everyone becomes responsible for the other person's life too. So unlike Willy Loman's life, where he thinks he failed as a husband, that he failed as a um, father, and perhaps to a certain extent as a friend, yeah, we find that there's a certain privateness about that experience, yeah, and there's also a sense of closure that the play arrives at with Willy Loman's death. There's of course there is a lot of disillusionment, there is a lot of holiness, and they also uh, do not they're unable to make sense of the kind of life that Willy Loman did, and that helplessness with which he died, which he went to grave, that is something which is difficult for the family. But there's also a sense of closure. There's a sense of containment for all sorts of emotions which are part of a play like Death of a Salesman. And the emotions in the play, the circumstances, everything could be superimposed onto any other American family's life, but all certain, and it continues to remain as a very private affair in a tangible sense, in a practical sense. We find that that is not the case at all in the case of Joe Keller. Here, his decision affects a lot many other people, which is why he tends to think that they were all his sons, yeah, implying the tragedy is something which cannot be contained in a private sense. It becomes a national tragedy in some sense. So here also, Joe Keller also, the play ends with his death again. So we find that the nature of death is also very different. Yeah, here we find Joe Keller killing himself in order to escape from a sense of guilt, in order to escape from these many things within which he finds himself implicated in. But we find that in Willy Loman's case, he walks towards his death just so his family could be rescued in some sense. There will be financial security, hopefully, for the family, which it doesn't work that way, we realize. So while both plays ends in somewhat similar ways over here, but we realize that the actions that pushed them towards that moment and the implications of those actions are very, very different. But what brings both of these plays together within a common thread of narrative, within a common framework, is also the fact that this gives us different lenses, different prisms through which we can look at the character of the American dream. The American dream becomes this very volatile image over here, a very volatile metaphor for not just for things working out well for the nation, not just for prosperity, not just for material success. It also becomes a volatile metaphor for everything that could potentially go wrong when a set of people, a set of very ordinary individuals are pursuing this dream. So this is an instance which also reveals the kind of impact that this play had on the on the popular culture, on the national at the national front. So there was this House of Un-American Activities Committee, which was founded in 1938 for investigating the communist influences or the fascist influences within the country. This was also a time when there was a growing concern about the communist ideals taking getting traction in Europe and the rest of the world. So Miller was called to appear before this committee, the House of American Activities Committee, because he was critiquing the American dream very poignantly in All My Sons. This also reveals to us the nature of this direct critique as compared to a play like Death of a Salesman. Right, so these are some of the major themes which get explored in this play. The criticism of the American dream being the most poignant one, which takes different shapes and different colors as we progress through the play. The crisis of the post-war society, which again takes us to a takes us into a comparative mode with the post-war writings in Britain and rest of Europe. We find that the crisis that America began to face as a post-war society was very different in nature, because their involvement in the World War, as we know, was of a slightly different nature altogether. So it also led them to facing very unique kind of problems. For them, they did not have a model per se to look back and emulate. They also, in some sense, the American society was literally thrown into the middle of the war, yeah, due to the circumstances and due to certain decisions or certain misdecisions that the nation had taken. So those are some of the aspects that we will be able to delve into when we are looking at the play in detail, and it also gives us a possibility to examine the post-war societal concerns, societal conditions in America vis-a-vis, say, Britain or the rest of Europe, vis-a-vis any other country which had also survived the World War in some form or the other, or were traumatized and victimized by the Second World War. So it also has a very different take on the aspects of responsibility and morality. For the sake of convenience, and since we are already familiar with Death of Salesman, we will continue to go back and forth in order to give a more comparative and more objective kind of analysis. Guilt and atonement are two very emotional, psychologically charged themes which gets a sort of a perfection as and when we find, we go through the play. So we will start looking at the play and then wrap up the discussion and come back to take a closer look at different sections when you're also a little more familiar with the play, hopefully. So these are the set of characters. This is a play in 3 acts, and these are the set of characters whom we will be meeting as we move forward. The act ones, we will read through the description first, and we will also find how these descriptions, these stage directions, they have an immense role to play in setting the stage, literally as well as metaphorically. And we noticed, how these descriptions also lend a certain character to the entire setting, and that setting, sometimes, here the setting remains unnamed town. It's an unnamed town, and even when it stays unnamed, the descriptions help us to understand the characters even better too. So the Act 1 opens in the backyard of the Keller home in the outskirts of an American town, August of our era. So this is an unnamed town unless Death of a Salesman, and we also find that this opens in the backyard and not in the living room like it did in the Death of a Salesman opened in the living room of the Lohman family. The stage is hedged on right and left by tall, closely planted poplars, which lend the yard a secluded atmosphere. So these terms are very useful for us to kind of get to the heart of the emotion that the play is trying to foreground right from the beginning. Upstage is filled with the back of the house and its open, unroofed porch, which extends into the yard some 6 feet. The house is 2 stories high and has 7 rooms. It would have cost perhaps $15,000 in the early 20s when it was built. Look at these descriptions and how the financial aspect becomes part of the description of the architecture. It is not just about how it looks, it's also about what one had to, how much one had to pay in order to get this structure erected. So the aesthetics begins to coexist with the financial aspect of it, and this is also, part and parcel of the way in which materialism becomes a huge thing during this this time. So it straight away, in a very unapologetic and very direct terms, dives into the unattractive aspects in terms of the cost. Even when it is talking about the number of rooms and the what one sees in the backyard. So it would have cost perhaps $15,000 in the early 20s when it was built. And it's also interestingly, unlike the earlier times, here cost becomes a marker to situate the value or the aesthetics of an architecture. So the structure gets value because of the cost that was invested into it. So and we also get to know that at the times that look at the way I find this very fascinating. It would have cost perhaps $15,000 in the early 20s when it was built. It does not stop just with $15,000, but $15,000 in the early 20s, just so we get a sense of the value of currency during that time. It is not the $15,000 in the 1940s, but we are talking about the $15,000 in the early 20s when it was built. It's helping one situate the cost in a historical sense. So here, money becomes something historical as well. The value of money, which keeps changing, which also becomes a newer kind of concern in terms of the shaping of a nation, the shaping of a society that gets replicated perfectly in such descriptions. Now it's nicely painted, looks tight and comfortable, and the yard with green with sod here and there plants whose season is gone. At the right beside the house, the entrance of the driveway can be seen, but the poplars cut off view of its continuation downstage. In the left corner, downstage, stands a 4-foot high stump of a slender apple tree whose upper trunk and branches lie toppled beside it, fruit still clinging to its branches. There's also a fine blend of the materialistic world and certain very stereotypical countryside descriptions. The apple tree, yeah, and the poplars, yeah, and the kind of plants which, come and go in terms of the season. Downstage right is a small trellis arbor shaped like shaped like a seashell with a decorative bulb hanging from its forward curving roof. Garden chairs and a table are scattered about. A garbage pail on the ground next to the porch, steps, a wire leaf burner near it. Very, very graphic and detailed description. This attention to detail is something that we had begun to notice in this genre from the early 20th century onwards. On the rise, it's early Sunday morning, and this location is again very interesting. We find that this rootedness is always there. This everydayness, this quality of giving the mundane details has been part of this genre again, from particularly from its this turn towards a realist mode. Joe Keller is sitting in the sun, reading the want ads of the Sunday paper, and the other sections of which lie neatly on the ground beside him. Behind his back, inside the arbor, Dr. Jim Bayliss is reading part of the paper at the table. Yeah, it is a household setting. Keller is nearing 60, a heavy man of stolid mind and build, a businessman these many years, but with the imprint of the machine shop worker and the boss still upon him. When he reads, when he speaks, when he listens, it is with the terrible concentration of the uneducated man. For him, there is still wonder in many commonly known things. Yeah? So we are able to situate this character in very material terms over here. A man whose judgments must be dredged out of experience, and a peasant like common sense, a man among men. Yeah? So here is a way in which, despite the ordinariness of Keller, he is being made to stand out. Yeah? He's uneducated. There is a certain peasant-like a quality about his responses, about his experiences, but there is also something about him which makes him stand out. Yeah. So the detailed description of this setting is also meant to make him stand out in that sense. Yeah. And Dr. Bayliss, he's nearly 40, a wry, self-controlled man, an easy talker, but with a wisp of sadness that clings even to his self-effacing humor. At curtain, Jim is standing at left, staring at the broken tree. He taps a pipe on it, blows through the pipe, feels in his pockets for tobacco, then speaks. Tobacco, yeah, that also becomes a very significant marker, which also has connections with trade, which also has connections with the nation's economy. Those are some of the fine aspects that we will continue to explore as we progress with this play. They begin with a very mundane discussion over here, and we will stop with this point where Keller says that about his newspaper reading experience. Every Sunday ought to be like this. Want the paper? What's the difference? It's all bad news. What's today's calamity? So look at this attitude, look at the response, look at what they expect on a Sunday morning when they are looking at the newspaper. What's a new calamity? There's nothing much to look forward to when one is picking up the newspaper on a Sunday morning except to know what the next calamity is. There is a certain preparedness over here which is disturbing at the same time. And Keller says, I don't know, I don't need the news part anymore. It's more interesting in the want ads. Why are you trying to buy something? No, I'm just interested to see what people want, For instance, here's a guy is looking for 2 Newfoundland dogs. Now, what's he wanted? 2 Newfoundland dogs. That's funny. Here's another one. Wanted old dictionaries. High prices paid. Now, what's a man going to do with an old dictionary? Why not? Probably a book collector. You mean he'll make a living out of that? Sure, there's a lot of them. So, all the kind of business going on. In my day, either you were a lawyer or a doctor, or you worked in a shop. Yeah, well, I was going to be a forester once. Yeah, well, that shows you in my day, there was no such thing. Scanning the page, sweeping it with his hand. You look at a page like this, you realize how ignorant you are. Yeah, so this is a very important beginning over here. This opening tells us a lot, not just about the characters, not just about the familiar settings within which he is placed, but largely about how the character is placed in contrast with the changing attitudes, the changing business culture, the changing consumerist attitude. Yeah. So he is not, he's looking at the newspaper to find, to see what people want. So here is, the American economy, the American society is in a certain moment, at a certain moment in history, when this shift towards the consumerist economy, the consumerist society, it's getting captured in very beautiful terms over here. So we will come back to look at this in greater detail. By then, hopefully, you'll also find some, we'll begin to start reading the play, and it'll be easier for us to have a discussion out of this. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session after having read the significant section of the play by yourself. Yeah, thank you again.